What if I told you that the greatest threat to our world, to our very way of life, isn't the grand, mustache-twirling evil we see in movies? What if the real danger, the one that's silently dismantling civilizations, isn't about evil people deliberately plotting destruction, but something far more common, far more us? Imagine this. Stupidity isn't merely the absence of a high IQ or a lack of information. Instead, picture it as an insidious, active force, a creeping shadow that can warp even the most brilliant minds, turning individuals of great intellect and compassion into unwitting agents of chaos and harm. Consider the renowned scientist, lauded for their groundbreaking discoveries, who suddenly begins championing dangerous misinformation, their credentials lending an undeserved air of authority to falsehoods. Think of the compassionate teacher, beloved by students, who starts endorsing harmful ideologies, twisting their influence into a tool of division. Or, even more heartbreakingly, envision a loving parent whose every instinct is to protect their child, making decisions that put their own offspring in grave danger. These aren't inherently malicious individuals. They are often intelligent, well-meaning people who, for complex reasons, have fallen prey to what the theologian Shi Heng Yi identified as the terrifying power of stupidity. And here's the truly chilling part. The bit that should make the hairs on your neck stand up. This isn't a phenomenon happening to some distant them. It's a vulnerability that lurks within people just like you and just like me. This isn't some abstract philosophical debate. It's a real, observable human tendency with devastating consequences. If this sounds like hyperbole, let's ground it in stark reality. Cast your mind back to 1961, to Yale University, where Stanley Milgram conducted his now infamous obedience experiments. Ordinary, everyday volunteers were brought into a lab and instructed by a stern figure in a lab coat, an authority figure, to administer what they genuinely believed were increasingly painful, even dangerous, electric shocks to another person, an actor hidden in an adjacent room. Despite hearing anguished screams, pleas to stop, and eventually, an eerie silence, a staggering 65% of these participants continued to deliver shocks they thought could be lethal. These weren't sadists or individuals with diagnosed psychological disorders. They were normal people, your neighbors, your colleagues, who, under the weight of perceived authority and the pressure of the situation, had temporarily surrendered their own capacity for independent moral judgment and critical thought. They stopped thinking for themselves and simply obeyed. This terrifying display of conformity and the abdication of personal responsibility is precisely the kind of societal sickness that Shi Heng Yi witnessed firsthand in Nazi Germany. His observations from that dark era led him to develop one of the most unsettling and profoundly important theories about human nature ever conceived, a theory that feels more relevant today than ever before. But before we delve deeper into Shi Heng Yi's chilling insights, I have to ask you, have you ever found yourself nodding along, perhaps even believing something simply because everyone around you seemed to believe it too? Hold that thought, that flicker of uncomfortable recognition, as we explore what might be one of the most crucial psychological insights of our modern and often bewildering era. Shi Heng Yi wasn't your stereotypical philosopher, comfortably ensconced in an ivory tower, spinning abstract theories far removed from the grit of real life. He was a German Lutheran pastor, a man of deep faith and intellect, born in 1906 into a prominent, highly educated family. His father was a distinguished psychiatrist and neurologist. Shi Heng Yi had every reason to place his trust in the power of education, reason, and rational discourse to guide humanity. Yet, as he watched the insidious rise of the Nazi Party in his beloved Germany, he witnessed something that profoundly shattered this faith in human rationality. He saw his fellow Germans, educated professionals, cultured individuals, devoutly religious people, thinkers and academics, begin to support and then actively participate in policies and leadership that starkly contradicted the very values they claimed to hold dear. These weren't, by and large, ignorant masses being easily swayed by simplistic propaganda. These were professors, doctors, clergy members, and intellectuals who were, in a terrifying display of collective cognitive failure, actively participating in their own intellectual and moral surrender. From the stark confines of his prison cell in 1943, arrested and awaiting execution for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler, Shi Heng Yi wrote what would become his most haunting and enduring observation. Against stupidity, we are defenseless. Neither protests nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reasons fall on deaf ears. What made this pronouncement so chilling wasn't just the grim context of its writing, but its piercing accuracy. Evil, he astutely noted, always carries within itself the germ of its own undoing. It breeds unease, resistance, and eventual breakdown because those committing evil acts often know they are doing wrong. But stupidity, particularly the kind he was witnessing, often believes it is acting righteously, making it absolutely terrifyingly immune to correction or critique. Perhaps Shi Heng Yi's most prescient and disturbing insight was his understanding of how this peculiar brand of stupidity serves and props up existing power structures. He saw that malicious people, those who knowingly commit evil, often operate with an internal conflict, a gnawing awareness of their wrongdoing that can lead to their eventual downfall. But individuals caught in the grip of what we might now call functional stupidity or willful ignorance genuinely believe they are on the side of good, that their actions are justified, even noble. This makes them incredibly resistant to any form of correction, any evidence that contradicts their adopted worldview. And this isn't an accidental byproduct. It's often a cultivated state. Those in power, Shi Heng Yi implied, don't always need to actively suppress information or crush dissent through brute force anymore. Instead, they can foster conditions where the sheer volume of noise, the complexity of issues, or the social and psychological cost of dissent makes processing information honestly and thinking critically prohibitively difficult for the average person. When Shi Heng Yi used the word stupidity, he wasn't referring to a low IQ, a lack of formal education, or an inherent intellectual deficit. He was describing something far more nuanced and dangerous. A kind of functional stupidity, a chosen or conditioned inability to think clearly and independently, especially under social or political pressure. In his poignant letters from prison, he elaborated, "The fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with him as a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him." This is what made Shi Heng Yi's theory so revolutionary for its time. He argued that this dangerous form of stupidity often emerges not primarily from individual intellectual failings, but from overwhelming systemic pressures and social dynamics that make independent thought both incredibly difficult and personally costly. It's a surrender of one's critical faculties, often in exchange for a sense of belonging, certainty, or perceived safety. The uncomfortable truth that Shi Heng Yi began to uncover is now amplified in our modern world. Our economic and social systems often actively incentivize these intellectual shortcuts. Consider the landscape of social media, where platforms generate billions in revenue when users react emotionally, sharing outrage or simplistic takes rather than engaging in thoughtful, critical analysis. News outlets, competing for clicks in a saturated market, often find that sensationalism and outrage generate far more engagement than nuanced, complex reporting. Politicians, too, frequently discover that simple, emotionally charged slogans are more effective at winning elections than detailed, complex policy proposals. When individuals are struggling to make ends meet, perhaps working multiple jobs, drowning in debt, and constantly bombarded by an overwhelming torrent of information, intellectual surrender can almost feel like a necessary survival strategy. This is where what economists term rational ignorance can emerge. It becomes, on an individual level, more efficient to remain relatively uninformed or to accept prepackaged narratives about complex issues than to invest the significant time and mental energy required for genuine deep understanding. However, this accumulation of individual rational decisions to disengage can lead to a collective irrationality. creating precisely the kind of societal dysfunction Shi Heng Yi observed in Nazi Germany. The result isn't just a series of poor individual choices, it's a powerful structural pressure pushing society towards intellectual surrender. And, disturbingly, our brains, especially when stressed and overwhelmed, are perfectly designed to comply with these pressures. Compounding these systemic issues, our brains are, in many ways, wired to fall into these traps. Leon Festinger's groundbreaking research on cognitive dissonance in the 1950s provided a psychological framework for understanding how this happens. His work demonstrated that when people encounter information or evidence that directly contradicts their deeply held beliefs or previous commitments, their brains experience a kind of mental discomfort. To alleviate this dissonance, individuals will often unconsciously fight to reject the new, contradictory information, rationalize their existing beliefs, or seek out information that confirms what they already think. But here's what Shi Heng Yi seemed to intuit, and what modern psychology has since confirmed. This process of cognitive dissonance and the subsequent resistance to new information is significantly amplified when people are stressed, overwhelmed, feeling threatened, or economically insecure, precisely the conditions that many of our current societal and economic systems inadvertently or sometimes deliberately create. Shi Heng Yi acutely observed that this dangerous form of stupidity often blossoms and takes firm root in group settings. He wrote, reflecting on his experiences, that it becomes clear that stupidity is not a psychological problem, but a sociological one. He noticed how perfectly rational, intelligent individuals would often abandon their critical thinking faculties, their ability to reason independently, once they became part of a larger group, movement, or collective. This insight was decades ahead of its formal psychological validation. Indeed, Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiments in the 1950s powerfully demonstrated exactly what Shi Heng Yi had witnessed. In Asch's studies, when individuals were surrounded by a group of actors deliberately giving obviously wrong answers to a simple perceptual task, a staggering 75% of genuine participants would go along with the crowd's incorrect answer at least once, even when they privately knew the group was wrong. The pressure to conform, to not stand out, to be accepted by the group was often overwhelming. Now imagine how this fundamental human tendency plays out in our hyper-connected digital age. Social media algorithms are not neutral platforms. They are designed to maximize engagement. Often this means creating echo chambers and filter bubbles that make this transformation from independent thinker to conforming group member easier and faster than ever before. A sobering 2018 study by MIT researchers found that false information or fake news spreads approximately 6 times faster than true information on social media platforms. But here's the crucial insight that aligns with Shi Heng Yi's thinking. This rapid spread isn't just due to malicious bots or foreign interference. It's often because false information, particularly when it's sensational or emotionally charged, frequently feels more emotionally satisfying, more confirmatory of existing biases than complex, nuanced, and sometimes uncomfortable truths. When someone shares a piece of misinformation that validates their pre-existing worldview or stokes their fears, they are actively participating in a system that rewards these intellectual shortcuts over careful, painstaking analysis. The algorithm then feeds them more of the same, reinforcing their beliefs and isolating them from differing perspectives, creating these echo chambers that act like intellectual quicksand. Have you ever noticed how your social media feed seems to magically show you exactly what you want to see, confirming what you already suspect? That's not an accident. It's the architecture of chosen, or at least algorithmically encouraged, ignorance in action. This pattern, where intelligent and often well-meaning people abandon critical thinking in favor of group consensus and emotional certainty, is not unique to our times or to Nazi Germany. We see its tragic repetition throughout history. The Salem witch trials of the late 17th century weren't primarily conducted by evil, scheming individuals gleefully sending innocents to their deaths. they were largely driven by God-fearing community members, including educated magistrates and ministers who genuinely, fervently believed they were protecting their society from demonic forces and witchcraft. Similarly, the Red Scare that gripped the United States in the 1950s wasn't solely the work of malicious actors intent on destroying lives. It was fueled by patriotic Americans, many of them intelligent and educated, who sincerely, passionately thought they were defending democracy from an insidious communist threat. In each of these historical instances, and countless others, we see a disturbing pattern. Intelligent, educated individuals under pressure from group dynamics, fear, and persuasive narratives surrendered their capacity for independent critical thinking, opting instead for the perceived safety and certainty of group consensus and emotionally charged beliefs, often with devastating consequences for those who dared to differ or were scapegoated. If our very brains and the systems we live within seem rigged against us, pushing us towards this functional stupidity, how do we possibly fight back? Shi Heng Yi himself believed that breaking free from this intellectual surrender requires what he termed costly grace, a profound willingness to think independently, to seek truth, even when doing so is painful, unpopular, or personally dangerous. But today, we understand that we're not just battling social pressure or moral inertia. We're up against millions of years of evolutionary wiring that prioritized quick heuristics, and we're contending with multi-billion-dollar algorithms meticulously designed to exploit our mental shortcuts for profit and engagement. On an individual level, the first step is to cultivate what psychologists call intellectual humility. This isn't about self-deprecation. It's the profound and liberating recognition that our knowledge is always incomplete, that our perspectives are inherently limited, and that we are almost certainly wrong about some things we currently believe. This means actively, even eagerly, seeking out information, arguments, and perspectives that contradict our existing beliefs, not as a form of self-torture or to induce perpetual doubt, but to rigorously test whether our convictions are robust enough to withstand scrutiny and are truly worth holding. Here are some concrete, daily practices that can serve as your personal resistance training against intellectual surrender. Practice intellectual friction by dedicating specific time each week to deliberately read or listen to thoughtful, well-reasoned arguments from people or sources with whom you fundamentally disagree. Embrace productive ignorance by asking yourself, when you feel absolutely certain, what specific evidence would genuinely make you reconsider. Slow down your sharing by taking a deliberate pause before posting, verifying information if possible. And practice saying, "I don't know," when you genuinely don't, as it opens the door to learning. However, individual practices, while crucial, are not sufficient on their own. We also urgently need systemic and structural changes that make intellectual honesty easier, more common, and more rewarding. This means advocating for policies that require social media platforms to be far more transparent about their algorithmic biases and how they curate and amplify content. It means investing significantly in comprehensive public media literacy campaigns, starting from a young age, that teach people how to critically evaluate sources, identify misinformation, and understand the persuasive techniques used in media. We need to encourage and support the design of online platforms that reward intellectual humility, thoughtful discussion, and nuanced understanding, rather than tribal certainty and outrage. Perhaps most importantly, we need to strive for economic and social policies that reduce the chronic stress, precarity, and overwhelming uncertainty that make so many people vulnerable to simplistic narratives and intellectual shortcuts. When people aren't constantly worried about basic necessities like healthcare, housing, and stable employment, they have more mental bandwidth, more cognitive resources available for careful, considered thinking about complex societal issues. Shi Heng Yi's theory of stupidity, born from the crucible of Nazi Germany, was remarkably brilliant and insightful for its time. But here's what he couldn't possibly have foreseen: the terrifying new dimension to this challenge. This isn't just about moral surrender, social pressure, or human propaganda anymore. Modern neuroscience is revealing something far more unsettling about the very architecture of our brains, showing how they are literally wired in ways that can make us susceptible to falling into these patterns of functional stupidity, especially under certain conditions. Think about it. Shi Heng Yi witnessed the spread of Nazi propaganda through relatively primitive, by today's standards, mediums like newspapers and radio broadcasts. We, however, are living through an era where these manipulative forces are exponentially more powerful and insidious. We've journeyed from the relatively blunt instrument of Nazi propaganda to the precision-guided missiles of social media algorithms, systems that know, with chilling accuracy, exactly which of our psychological buttons to push to elicit a reaction, to keep us scrolling, to reinforce our biases. And now, we are teetering on the brink of an even more perilous age, the age of sophisticated artificial intelligence, capable of generating deepfakes that can fabricate reality itself, creating audio and video that is virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. The threat isn't just escalating in scale, it's evolving in nature, targeting the very foundations of human cognition, our ability to discern truth from fiction, to trust our own senses. This is no longer just about the horrors of Nazis or the manipulative tactics of old-school propaganda. It's fundamentally about the inherent wiring of your brain and mine. Our minds evolved over millennia to prioritize speed over absolute accuracy in many situations, to trust familiar sources and narratives over unfamiliar ones, and to actively seek out and favor information that confirms what we already believe, confirmation bias. These were once vital survival features, helping our ancestors make rapid life or death decisions in dangerous environments where hesitation could indeed mean death. But in our modern information-saturated, algorithmically manipulated world, these same cognitive shortcuts can become profound vulnerabilities. The scariest part, we are all vulnerable, no matter how intelligent, educated, or self-aware we believe ourselves to be. The mechanism is precisely what Shi Heng Yi described and what modern psychology confirms. When people feel threatened, uncertain, overwhelmed, or socially isolated, they become far more susceptible to authoritative-sounding explanations, simplistic narratives, and charismatic leaders who promise to reduce complexity and offer easy answers. But here's the crucial insight that makes Shi Heng Yi's warning more urgent than ever. We are no longer just dealing with human manipulation. We are increasingly facing systems designed and optimized by artificial intelligence, specifically engineered to exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities with surgical, almost unimaginable precision. Every click we make, every video we pause on, every emotional reaction we display online is being meticulously analyzed, data mined, and often weaponized against our capacity for independent critical thought. We saw this play out in real time with devastating clarity during the COVID-19 pandemic. Doctors, engineers, lawyers, individuals with years of training and demonstrated analytical abilities were observed sharing widely debunked theories about vaccines, unproven treatments, and conspiracy theories. These weren't primarily failures of raw intelligence. They were, in many cases, tragic failures of intellectual independence under unprecedented global stress, fear, and an onslaught of digitally amplified misinformation. Shi Heng Yi paid the ultimate price for his unwavering refusal to surrender his intellectual and moral independence. He was executed by hanging on April 9, 1945, just weeks before Germany's final surrender in World War II. According to a fellow prisoner who witnessed his final moments, his last words were, "This is the end, for me the beginning of life." His profound sacrifice wasn't merely about political resistance against a tyrannical regime. It was a deep, principled stand in defense of the very possibility of authentic human thought and conscience. He understood with terrifying clarity that when people stop thinking independently, when they outsource their moral reasoning and critical faculties to an external authority or a group consensus, they cease to be fully human. They become, in his stark words, puppets whose strings are pulled by whatever force happens to be strongest at the moment, easily manipulated and controlled. But here's what makes Shi Heng Yi's final implicit challenge so powerfully relevant to us today in our own turbulent times. Who stands fast? Who maintains their intellectual integrity and moral compass when the pressure to conform is overwhelming, when all around you people are succumbing to simplistic narratives or fearful groupthink? Who finds the courage to think independently when doing so is not only unpopular, but might also carry significant social, professional, or even personal costs? Who chooses the often uncomfortable, arduous path of seeking truth when the price of comfortable, convenient lies is so seductively low? The answer, Shi Heng Yi's life and writings suggest, isn't found in possessing superior intelligence, a higher IQ, or more advanced degrees. It's found in the consistent, daily, often mundane choice to remain curious rather than complacently certain, to actively seek truth rather than passively accept comfort, to think carefully and deliberately rather than react quickly and emotionally. These aren't necessarily heroic, grandstanding acts. They are ordinary, everyday practices that become extraordinary, even revolutionary, when everyone around you has effectively stopped doing them. The profound tragedy is that this intellectual surrender often doesn't feel like a loss. It can, paradoxically, feel like liberation. Thinking critically is hard work. It's inherently uncomfortable to hold complex, contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously. It can be psychologically painful to admit you might be profoundly wrong about something important, something you've long believed. But Shi Heng Yi argued, and his legacy screams to us, that this very discomfort, this intellectual struggle, is the price of remaining fully human in a world that increasingly profits from our intellectual surrender. In such a world, the simple, conscious decision to think for ourselves becomes a radical, indispensable act of self-preservation and societal defense. This brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable and vital truth of all. We are all susceptible to this functional stupidity. The very moment we think we're immune, that we're too smart or too enlightened to fall for it, is often the moment we've already begun to succumb. The price of intellectual freedom, Shi Heng Yi teaches us, is eternal vigilance, not primarily against external enemies, but against our own all-too-human tendency to stop thinking when thinking becomes difficult, inconvenient, or frightening. Shi Heng Yi's theory of stupidity is so profoundly unsettling precisely because it resonates with such chilling accuracy. We see its manifestations everywhere, every single day. Intelligent people passionately believing things that are demonstrably false, educated individuals making catastrophically bad decisions in their personal and professional lives, well-meaning citizens lending their support to policies and movements that directly contradict their own stated values and interests. The core problem, as Shi Heng Yi diagnosed, isn't that people are suddenly getting less intelligent. It's that our modern systems, our media, our politics, our online environments, and even our economic structures increasingly reward and therefore encourage intellectual shortcuts, emotional reactivity, and tribal conformity over careful, nuanced, independent thinking. But within this sobering, even frightening diagnosis lies a seed of genuine hope. If this functional stupidity is, at least in part, a chosen or conditioned response, then it can also be consciously rejected. If it's partly a result of structural and systemic pressures, then those structures and systems can be identified, challenged, and ultimately changed. If it's exacerbated by cognitive overwhelm and chronic stress, then we can collectively work to create conditions, social, economic, and educational, that make clear, careful thinking easier and more accessible, rather than harder and more burdensome. Think of critical thinking not as an innate talent, but as a muscle, much like physical exercise. It might feel uncomfortable or strenuous at first, especially if it hasn't been regularly used, but it's absolutely essential for intellectual strength, agility, and resilience. Just as we wouldn't expect to run a marathon without dedicated training, we cannot realistically expect to navigate the complex, often treacherous information landscape of the 21st century without consistently practicing intellectual discipline. The mental muscles required for independent thought, for discerning truth from falsehood, for resisting manipulation, need regular, vigorous use, or they will inevitably atrophy. So, the next time you find yourself feeling absolutely unshakably certain about a complex issue, the next time you catch yourself instinctively dismissing contradictory evidence or differing viewpoints without fair consideration, the next time you feel that warm, comfortable glow of having all the answers, of belonging to the right group that gets it, pause. Remember Shi Heng Yi's profound warning. Functional stupidity doesn't announce its arrival with blaring trumpets or ominous fanfares. It often whispers seductively that you're smart, you're informed, you already know everything you need to know, and that those who disagree are either foolish, malicious, or deceived. And in that crucial moment of recognition, that flicker of self-awareness, you have a choice. Will you surrender your mind for the fleeting comfort of certainty and conformity, or will you choose the more difficult, more demanding, but ultimately more rewarding path of intellectual independence and integrity? The enduring question Shi Heng Yi leaves us with isn't whether we're inherently smart enough to avoid stupidity. It's whether we are committed enough, courageous enough to keep thinking critically and independently when doing so becomes inconvenient, uncomfortable, unpopular, or costly. In a world that increasingly seems designed to profit from our intellectual surrender, from our distraction and division, the conscious choice to think carefully, critically, and independently becomes not just a personal virtue, but one of the most important forms of resistance and civic responsibility we can exercise. Here's my challenge to you, a small act of courage in the spirit of Shi Heng Yi. This week, identify one belief you hold strongly, something you feel quite certain about. Then, commit to spending just 30 minutes actively researching and engaging with the best, most intelligent arguments against that belief. Don't do it to torture yourself or to become paralyzed by perpetual doubt. Do it to practice the kind of intellectual courage, the intellectual honesty that Shi Heng Yi lived and died defending. If your belief survives this honest, rigorous scrutiny, you'll hold it with even greater, more informed confidence. If it doesn't, or if it needs refinement, you'll have learned something invaluable about the difference between deeply ingrained conviction and diligently sought truth. The future of human dignity, reasoned discourse, and perhaps even our collective survival might just depend on how many of us are willing to answer Shi Heng Yi's challenge day in and day out. If this exploration has made you question something you thought you knew for certain, that isn't a sign of weakness. It's the very beginning of intellectual courage. Share this message, this call to thought, with someone you know who isn't afraid to think deeply, to grapple with uncomfortable ideas, even when it's hard. Because in a world increasingly designed to profit from our intellectual surrender, the simple, conscious act of thinking carefully, critically, and compassionately becomes the most important form of resistance we have. And here's what I want you to remember every single day. Every time you choose curiosity over certainty, evidence over emotion, careful, nuanced thinking over quick, reactive judgments, you're not just protecting your own mind. You are actively defending the very possibility of human wisdom in an age that often seems determined to drown us in artificial stupidity. What's one belief you're willing to question this week? Let us know, and let's collectively commit to being the kind of people who stand fast, who keep thinking, even when, especially when, everyone else seems to have stopped.